Okay, in this video, I want to go through topic 2.5, present and comment the main effects of globalization of competition on the firm, the consumer, and the government. All right, so perhaps we can start with the concept of globalization. Mondialisation in French, which is essentially the increase in economic integration between different countries. Initially, mostly before the Second World War, national economies, of course, they did trade with each other, but international trades were rather limited. And after the Second World War, we've witnessed a very important increase in international trades, where imports and exports became, the volume of imports and exports became much more important. And the consequence is that different national economies became more connected. There were more flows of goods or services, of assets, of money, of resources, anything that had value, basically, could be traded not only within a particular economy, but internationally. That's basically what we mean by globalization. So globalization of competition, because that's what the question is about, is essentially the idea that now firms do not only compete with other domestic firms, but they also compete with firms anywhere in the world. So of course, it depends on the type of product you are talking about. In particular, if you look at restaurants, hotels, because they only compete with firms within a particular geographical scope, globalization doesn't really affect them, or at least not to the same extent. But like if you are a car company, or if you produce computers, or if you produce goods and services, mostly goods actually, that can be shipped internationally, or even if you are a worker, you can compete with workers that are from different countries, or something for resources. If you produce steel, you can compete with firms all over the world. Basically, any good, service, or asset which is mobile geographically, that can move geographically, will be more affected by globalization of competition. So the question is about the consequences on the firm, the consumer, and the government. So let's start with the firm. Consequence on the firm. Well, let's start with the bad news. Is that, of course, there's a higher degree of competition. There's a higher degree of competition. We may be competing with more firms that are abroad. So we may lose market shares. And eventually there is even a risk of bankruptcy, right? The higher degree of competition to a risk. So that's the main problem. But there are also some good news, potentially. The good news, put it here, sorry. The good news is that now we can sell our products not only to domestic buyers, but we can sell our products all over the world. So the bad news is that, yeah, okay, we do face competition with other firms, but it also means that we can export our products to all over the world. We can export our products. So that's the good news from that perspective. They can gain market shares abroad. From the perspective of firms, it can also be a good news in the sense that it can allow firms to import raw materials that are either cheaper or have a better quality, or perhaps some inputs that we don't have, so we can produce more goods and services. import of better or cheaper raw materials. So that's basically, okay, I'm just focusing on the key elements here. So the bad news, more competition, but good news, yeah, we can export more and we can import raw materials and other resources at a lower cost. For the business in itself, that's could also be a good news that we can borrow money from abroad. You know, and before globalization, if you wanted to borrow money, you could only borrow from people in your country. So that means that you couldn't borrow much, right? But now that you can borrow from people in other country or organization all over the world, you can sell bonds, you can sell stocks, and anybody in the world can buy them. It's a good news. Okay. Trying to find another example of the bad news, but that's basically this. Okay. Now the consumer. A good or bad for consumers? Well, there's one reason for which it's good. They have more choice. Because again, now they are not limited to purchase the goods and services are produced by domestic firms. They can buy from anywhere in the world. Could be that prices will be lower for two reasons. First, because you may purchase items from countries that have lower costs of production, or could be simply because your domestic firms, they import resources at a lower cost and therefore they offer cheaper products. And remember what we said, that globalization increases the degree of competition, and competition can lead to lower prices. So consumers can do more choices, lower prices will also be better products, because some countries may be more advanced than others. So if you live in a developing country where, you know, like domestic firms, the firms in your country, they produce pretty bad products perhaps because they don't have access to the machinery, to the equipment, to the skills. But now if you can import consumer goods from more developed countries that have products that have better characteristics, well, of course, it's something that is that's quite good for you. For consumers, and I could add workers, the impact of employment is difficult to assess, because on the one hand, the fact that the firms in your country, they suffer from more competition from abroad, the risk is that if firms go bankrupt, some workers will lose their jobs. So that's like if your domestic firms are not very internationally competitive, it's likely that unemployment will increase, so that's bad. On the other hand, if your domestic firms are pretty competitive, it means that they will gain market shares abroad, and so they will produce more, and so jobs will be created. So the impact not really on consumer workers, people basically, in terms of employment opportunities, really depends on whether output is going to increase or decrease in your country as a result of globalization. So more choices, lower prices, better products, employment opportunities. That's about it for consumers. For the government, you can check in the notes we took in class. Perhaps I came up with additional elements, but these are the most important ones. So the government So again, like we said, globalization can help the government to borrow from other countries. We can borrow from other countries. Before globalization, governments could only borrow from the people living in the country, or the organization living in the country. Now we can borrow from any country, so that makes it easier for the government to finance a budget deficit, which is a good news. Globalization and international trade can benefit the government in the sense that if there are some tariffs in place, international trade can generate tax revenue. Can generate revenue. For example, if there are tariffs or taxes on imports, so we can simply capture some of the value of international trade by imposing some tariffs. If globalization stimulates economic activity, like we said, if this creates jobs, if domestic firms are competitive, if they gain market shares abroad and therefore produce more, it's good in the sense that it can improve the government's budget balance, because more tax, since the domestic economy will enjoy economic growth, it means that there will be more tax revenue, there will be less government spending on unemployment benefits, for example. So in that case, it would be good for the government's budget balance. But like I said, there is also a risk that the increased competition will lead to bankruptcies, firms not being competitive enough, people losing their jobs. You can end up with an economic recession. And in that case, it's bad for the government budget balance, because we will have less revenue from taxes as fewer people work and they spend less. And at the same time, we may have to pay more unemployment benefits. So, the impact on the budget balance, just like employment, it depends. It basically depends on whether globalization does more good than harm in this particular country. And I'll find the last one. We can borrow from other countries. We can. Yeah, and anytime it comes, for example, to when it comes to infrastructure, we can we can buy infrastructure from foreign businesses. We can rely foreign businesses to build public infrastructure. It's very often the case that, especially in poor countries, that governments, they don't have like the skills, the ability to build good communication, transportation infrastructure. They don't have the resources, they don't have the expertise. And so quite often those developing countries, they ask for support, and they just pay foreign businesses to just, come build the infrastructure for them. So that's also one way in which the government can benefit from globalization. Maybe we can add something about the economy overall, society as a whole. Could be good in terms of productive efficiency. For two main reasons. Reason number one, because there is more competition, so we have to be efficient in production, otherwise our cost of production will be too high, will not be competitive. But also because now, since we can trade internationally, countries can specialize. In certain countries, they can focus on producing only certain goods for which they are very efficient, which was not really possible before. Imagine if a country does not engage in international trade, it basically has to produce everything it needs. So it can't specialize, and it means that it must produce everything, including goods and services, for which it is not very productive. But through globalization, through international trade, countries know that, well, they don't have to produce everything. They can simply focus on what they are best at and export these items, and then import those goods and services for which they are not very productive. So in terms of the efficiency, like the world efficiency of resource allocation, it's good, because we're just going to allow countries to focus on producing what they are best at. So that's really a good thing. For the environment, however, it might not be amazing, because, well, of course, globalization involves a lot of transportation, which is very polluting. because there are some countries who can basically specialize in hosting some very polluting activities. These countries, we call them pollution havens. So that can be quite bad. It can lead to situations where there are tax havens. You know, those countries that have specialized in having very low taxes, and that's one way for companies to avoid taxes or even to evade taxes, to just relocate their headquarters in a country where there are very low taxes, and so they can avoid any tax liability. So it's bad for the government. Perhaps we could have added that in the category government. The existence of tax haven, which is made possible by globalization, can be quite bad. Remember, a tax haven is a country where taxes are very low, and that attracts a lot of businesses who don't want to pay taxes. Environmental damage, I talked about pollution havens, which is similar. These are countries that welcome very polluting activities. Why do they do that? Because these are usually very poor countries, and well, in order for them to boost their economic activity, they accept to damage their environment. And again, that's quite bad because there are some areas in the world where the environment is completely destroyed. But overall, this boost, this stimulates for society as a whole. It stimulates growth. Stimulates economic growth. But another disadvantage is that it increases dependency and makes us more vulnerable. That's the risk. Makes societies more vulnerable. Well, the best example is at the beginning of COVID, we realized that, but we don't have factories that produce face masks in Europe. So we have to import everything from China. But of course, the Chinese, they want to keep the masks for themselves first. Okay, it's understandable. So whenever we specialize and import a lot of goods and services from other countries, that makes us more dependent on our trading partners. And if anything goes wrong, if there is any crisis, that's clearly something that makes us more dependent on each other, especially when it comes to products that are quite important, like food, medication, microchips, national defense, anything that is essential. The fact that we stop producing certain items puts us at risk. Okay. Well, I think you have more than enough to talk 8 minutes on this. And again, it's likely to be combined with something else, but that's basically what globalization is and the consequences, the key consequences on consumers, on businesses, on the government, and on society as a whole.